Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Thank you for joining us at the 78th Conference on World Affairs at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I'm Vicki Sama, a journalism professor who teaches media law and ethics and reporting classes at the university. I'll be serving as your moderator today. For recording purposes, today's date is Thursday, April 16th, 2026, and the panel time is 9:30 a.m. The panel title is The Demise of a Free Press. Now, before we get started, I would like to read the university's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty in their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and work collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you once again, and welcome to the Conference on World Affairs and today's discussion. We ask that all our attendees remain respectful and refrain from any interruptions, and please silence your phones. Time will be given for audience questions, so for those of you here, you probably know the drill already. There are people walking around with cards and pens. You can raise your hand. They'll come over and hand you something to write on. You can put your question on there, and then they'll pick it up and bring it up to me. So now I'd like to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and remind the audience that their full bios are on the Conference on World Affairs website. Corinne, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially on this panel. I'm Corinne Hajar. I am an opinion journalist at the Washington Post. I work on the editorial board. And before that, I was a columnist and editorial board member at the Boston Globe.
My name is Abubakar Jamai. I'm originally from Morocco because now I live in Spain. I'm currently the Dean of the School of Global Affairs at the American College of the Mediterranean. But I spent a big chunk of my professional life as being the publisher and editor of a weekly magazine in Morocco.
Good morning. My name is Lorraine Bowles, and I formerly served as the Chief of Staff to Vice President Harris. My career has mostly been in government and politics and have always dealt with the media very directly. So I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Josh Levy. I'm a lawyer in Washington, D.C. at a law firm called Levy Firestone Muse. And our firm specializes in the representation of clients under investigation by the federal government, all aspects of the federal government, and in litigation. And over the last 20, 25 years, a number of my clients have been members of the news media and journalists.
Thank you all so much. And I want to just put this panel in some context. The description underneath the title of this panel says, in these unprecedented times, how do we protect the freedom of the press as the crucial fourth pillar of a stable democracy? And I want to talk about some of those unprecedented things that we are seeing right now on the press. The Trump administration has engaged in a series of attacks aimed at dismantling the free press. And I want to give you some examples. We have there's a $1.1 billion cut that was imposed on public broadcasting. That includes NPR and public broadcasting. There was a $10 billion lawsuit against the Wall Street Journal for its reporting of an alleged birthday card that Donald Trump sent to Jeffrey Epstein. The administration recently settled for $16 million a lawsuit against Paramount and CBS for the 60 Minutes coverage of former Vice President Kamala Harris's interview. The administration has settled a $15 million lawsuit against ABC News for misquotes made by the host George Stephanopoulos. Trump appointed the Project 2025 author Brendan Carr as the head of the Federal Communications Commission, which is now launched multiple investigations of media outlets that the president doesn't like. The White House has launched a website naming and shaming journalists it labels as liars or offenders. The president has been particularly aggressive, insulting women in the press, such as telling a Bloomberg reporter, "quiet piggy," and calling others stupid and ugly. So this is just a small start of some of the topics we're going to be talking about when it comes to the demise of a free press. So I think, Lorraine, you wanted to start today's conversation, so I'll let you have the mic.
Thank you. I don't know that I wanted to start the conversation, but one of the things I thought was really important to point out, and I'm sure so many of you are familiar with this, but it's just really illustrative of what's happening to a free press. And that starts with Secretary Hegseth and what he has done at the Pentagon to people who cover the Pentagon. So in the Pentagon, unlike the White House, reporters had access. They could freely walk the halls and meet with sources and, do their reporting. That has all been now limited. He's restricted access to their workspaces. So if a reporter declined to sign the pledge, and the pledge was that you would only report official news coming out of the Pentagon. So which means you wouldn't have private conversations, you wouldn't do your own source reporting, you would report official news. So thankfully, most reporters, not all, most reporters did not sign that pledge. And so what happened then, they lost their access and they lost their workspace. So I remember listening to a reporter from the New York Times, Erica Green, who's a very accomplished reporter, covered the White House, covered the Pentagon, has been a foreign correspondent, from her car. She was reporting from her car in the Pentagon parking lot, so she could call her sources and, do her work in her car. I think that is so illustrative of kind of the things that are happening and the things that that were mentioned by our moderator. So, thankfully, the administration lost the lawsuit. I think it came from the New York Times and others. Karine, you can correct me on that. And it was the actions of Hegseth were ruled unconstitutional. But it doesn't mean that the harassment hasn't ended. Thanks.
Anybody want to follow up on that?
I guess I'd just say that we've seen a pattern in this administration where they move quickly and break things, and then the courts do step in and often do the right thing on these issues. And so as much as the system isn't working, it is working. It just, we see these up front, these really chilling actions being taken by the administration, but as difficult as it is to watch this happen to my profession, to colleagues, to people that work in other outlets, I am heartened by the fact that the legal system is working here in many cases.
And speaking of legal system, Josh, do you want to follow up with that?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. The tension that the government has wrestled with for decades is between the Espionage Act and the First Amendment. The First Amendment, you all know New York Times versus Sullivan, the concurring opinion, 1971, Justice Black, who told us that the press is protected so that it can bear secrets to help inform the people. That's the purpose of the freedom of the press under the First Amendment, according to Justice Black. And that's in tension with the Espionage Act, which was enacted to criminalize the unauthorized disclosure and receipt and use of national defense information, basically classified information. And usually the government prosecutes and investigates leakers, keepers, and spies. It does not prosecute journalists. And that was the policy of the Justice Department in 2013. Attorney General Holder went before the Senate Judiciary Committee and said, we will not prosecute journalists for doing their jobs. President Obama went to the podium and said the same thing. That continued to be the policy of the Justice Department. Under the last administration, under President Biden, Attorney General Garland had a policy that the Justice Department wouldn't serve subpoenas on journalists for their confidential source material. And last year, the now former Attorney General Pam Bondi reversed that policy. And so what we've seen, in addition to the Pentagon issuing policies to revoke credentials from the press if they are inducing the unauthorized disclosure of information, that's the language and the policy that was struck down by Judge Friedman. In addition to that, the President of the United States has called on the Justice Department to investigate journalists as recently as 2 weeks ago for leaking information to the public. The House Committee has issued a subpoena to a journalist. The Justice Department executed a search warrant on a Washington Post reporter. And I completely agree with Karine that the courts are holding and they're doing their job. But a huge reason why the courts are doing their job is because the whole of the press is backing the individual reporter, the individual set of journalists, the individual news magazine or newspaper that is going to the court and asking the court to protect their rights, and that needs to continue.
So I guess my role here is to give you, an international perspective on what's going on in the U.S. And actually, it's a very relevant, I believe, angle to this debate, because I just want to underscore the importance of and the exemplarity of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Literally, just mentioned Sullivan against the New York Times. That changed the world, literally, because that became actually the concept on which democracies had based their relationship with between the press and the government, by basically malice has to be proved, etc., whereas before defamation was a very, very efficient way to silence people. So that led to a momentous change. A couple of things about my own trajectory, just to preface what I'm about to say. I was kicked out of my country when I was a journalist in Morocco. I had problems with my regime. That's the proper word, not the government, but the whole regime. And then I was forced out of the country. And one of the reasons I'm sad at what's going on today in the US is that I was extremely fortunate at the time to find a lot of support in this country, because when I was kicked out, I was actually very supported by the Committee to Protect Journalists. They offered me, Harvard University offered me a fellowship. I became a Nieman Fellow immediately out of my country. I ended up there. Obviously I was working with American journalists, and to me it was really and studying the history of the press in the United States. I was extremely admirative of the process. Not only that, another thing that I would like to share with you, while I was in the US, in Morocco, having problems with my government, the only country close to the Moroccan regime that really was serious about at least pretending to protect freedom of the press was the United States. I had never been invited to the French embassy or to any other European embassy. I was constantly invited to the US embassy. I can share with you one anecdote. That was in 2004. The US ambassador in Morocco was Margaret Weiler. We were in the middle, of course, of the war in Iraq, and our editorial line was extremely critical about US foreign policy in the Middle East. And so she accepted to give us an interview, so we went to interview her. And it was very hard-hitting and, very critical of US policy vis-a-vis Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. And so we finished the interview and we thanked her. And she told us, "Are you sure you have asked me everything you wanted to ask me?" And we said, yeah. She said, are you sure? I think you forgot something. And you said, no. What? And we were looking at our notes, et cetera. And she said, you forgot to ask me about what's happening to you in this country in terms of freedom of the press. And said, yes, of course. So we sat down, and she gave us basically this wonderful paragraph about how, the United States stands by freedom of the press, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, she was giving us protection. And we had just finished an interview which was very, very critical vis-a-vis US foreign policy in the region. Now, I have to say that at the same moment, probably there was some CIA guy with some... torturing people a couple of miles from where we were, because it happens that there was a black site, CIA black site, literally 2 miles from the residency where we were doing this interview. But that's the complexity of international relations. It does not, as I tell my students, it does not mean that she was hypocritical. I think we live in a complex world where these two very different universes live beside each other. But my point here is that what has been just described is extremely problematic, not only for you, but for a lot of journalists in the outside world. That's all.
So that's a good segue into the question of why we need a free press in the United States.
Sorry?
Why do we need a free press in the United States?
How many hours do we have?
How many hours? Who would like to answer?
Well, first I want to sort of address what does the press even mean, and since we're at the 250th, let's go back to the beginning. Some of you might have heard me talk about this the other day, but the press at the founding was like rather rambunctious and not these formal institutions that you think of. And independently published panels and smaller newspapers really shaped the republic that we have now. So common sense comes to mind automatically. And this free exchange of ideas across the colonies really did shape the ideals that became our country. And so as an opinion writer, who I do a lot of reporting, but I do it under opinion. I'm clear, or I like to think I'm clear about my biases. It's really important. That's always important to me to think about, because this country's built on an exchange of ideas, a free exchange of ideas. It continues to shape the way that our government creates policy, the way that we all relate to each other. And I think recently it's been difficult to see so much polarization, especially in ideas. And so I think a free press, and especially now we're seeing a lot of changes in media broadly, putting aside the question of how the government's evolved, media is changing a lot. And I'm really hopeful that the introduction of a lot of new ideas and different ways of thinking about things is really going to help remind our country and sort of turbocharge us into that more free and rambunctious exchange of ideas that we're built on.
I just want to piggyback on that a bit. Every political leader I have ever worked for, and there are a lot of them, has complained about the press. Every single one. Misquoting me, not getting the message right, they're after me. None of them would ever have done anything to limit their ability to do their jobs. It was just part of the process. And I think you think back on things that have happened over the years, and I'm not going to go back quite as far as Karine, but things that have happened that the press has exposed. And I'm sure you could name tons of them, but I'm going to name one that none of you know about, unless you went to George Washington University in the mid-2000s. The student newspaper reported on a situation in the law school. They did their own reporting. It was factual, it was accurate, and it didn't lead to, but it was reporting on the removal of the dean, because there was what was said to the press, and then the real kind of, what really happened. And he dug it all out. And so afterward, of course, and I was in a position where the university's press team reported to me. So we're all talking about like the president and, what are we going to do and this and that. After the meeting, when my staff and I were walking out, we were all like, yay, go. That's just what you want your students to do. It was like exciting. It was just a wonderful example of holding power to account. And that's why we need a free press, because you have to hold power to account.
Josh, you want to address that from a maybe First Amendment perspective?
Sure. In the Supreme Court case that establishes the qualified privilege, and it is a qualified privilege, not an absolute privilege, of a journalist to protect her sources and her communications with her sources. The court talks about the press in terms along the lines of what Karine was discussing. It is not just the New York Times. It is anyone who is trying to educate us about the public, really, including what they described as the lonely pamphleteer, which dates back to the era Karine was discussing. And that qualified privilege is really important. The source doesn't have that privilege, but the journalist does. And we want to make sure that journalists are able to operate without the fear that as they are confidentially working to help inform us about matters of public importance so that we as a democracy can make informed decisions, not uninformed decisions, about what our government is doing, that someone, whether it's a civil litigant or the Justice Department itself, won't come along with a subpoena to compel that journalist from disclosing her source material. And a lot of what happens in the practice of law is avoidance of having a court look at these questions at all, but instead having people in the government use their judgment and their discretion to strike the balance between protecting the national security and allowing us to have a robust democracy.
Well, the scholarly answer to your question is that the best system so far, or as Churchill said, the worst of the examples of all the others, which is representative, deliberative democracy, hinges on the fact that you give some people the keys of the car for a certain amount of time, and then you examine them or you grade them after 4 years or 3 years, etc. But what happened in the meantime? How do you avoid having successive little dictatorships? So you need the press to inform you about what's going on. How are these people dealing with your affairs? That's one. The second thing, when you go to your voting booth to vote, the quality of democracy exactly hinges on the quality of the information you put into your decision-making process to vote. So you need to be well informed. Your vote needs to be well informed. So that's the scholarly answer to your question. And just following up on what Josh has said, which I really find fascinating, and I'm no expert, I'm talking here being checked by experts. But what I find fascinating in the US is that, in fact, what we think is the privilege of the journalist is the privilege of every citizen. That's how the Supreme Court actually looked at it. And what I also find fascinating is that when you look at the major turning point in the history of the United States, and I have two in mind, I have the Vietnam War. I was struck by the fact that the media that revealed the My Lai massacre was the News Dispatch, which was a very little news agency. It was not the New York Times, the Post, etc., etc. I was also struck by the fact, and this is something I mentioned in another panel, that's one of the most decisive moments in the history of the United States, where basically progressivism saved capitalism, which was when you had the antitrust laws, etc., etc., was based on the work of a woman reporter called Ida Tarbell, who worked for a small, I think, weekly or monthly magazine, which means that it is important to preserve freedom of the press and to think about the big gorillas, the Washington Post, etc., etc. But you need to have an environment which is also hospitable for these little outlets, because they had made history in this country in terms of freedom of the press.
Do you mind if I just add something to that? So I wanted to talk a little bit about this because this is one of the challenges right now that the press is going through, I think, is kind of the demise of local press outlets. And, you know, I worked for a senator from Iowa, and I spent a lot as a press secretary. And I would go around whenever there was recess and visit the 300 weekly newspapers to, you know, talk about Senator Harkin, to give them information. There's a newspaper in Storm Lake, Iowa. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it. It's called the Storm Lake Pilot. And the editor is a guy by the name of Art Cullen. And I wanted to recommend this documentary to any of you. It's called Storm Lake. And it's about how this small town newspaper, 3,000 people in the town, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner, by the way, covers the news that's affecting the people in Storm Lake, big ag, clean water, et cetera. But it got me thinking about the importance of small outlets covering big things and little things.
Josh, did you want to make a comment, or otherwise I'll go to an audience question? Okay, I'm going to go to an audience question. Can the free press continue when press owners, the corporations, support the very president who attacks it?
I'm going to assume that that's directed at me. First of all, obviously the Washington Post has been in the news a lot lately. Our owner has very clearly said that his business is a complexifier, but he's been completely committed to protecting our reporting, our news side's reporting, and the institution itself I have a lot of confidence in. You can open the website any day and see major news being reported, keeping government accountable. You can go see our editorials, not pulling punches on anyone of any political party. I'll talk about the board because that's where I work. We are guided by two pillars, personal liberties and free markets. And these are both things that both parties trample on literally all the time, including the president. So in that case, we are always calling people out, no matter what party, no matter what partisanship. So I feel really hopeful about I feel really hopeful about the institution. And I also just want to add that trust in media has been falling. And I've said this a lot this week, so apologies if you've heard this before, but the last Gallup poll I checked, I think that national media had less trust in it than Congress, which is damning. I don't know if it's still the case this year, but at least 2 years ago that was the case. And that's not an ownership problem. That is a trend that has held, and it's really concerning for the media. Our owner wrote an op-ed a year or two ago about why a lot of changes have been happening and addressing the trust in the media. And I think that having conversations about things like personal liberties and free markets on the opinion side is one step towards rebuilding the trust with our readers.
Corinne, I have a question. Sure. Famously, the Washington Post decided not to endorse Kamala Harris when she was running for president. Could you talk a little bit about that in terms of how that decision was made, if it came down from the top, if it was a group decision? I would just be probably more interested than most.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I wasn't at the Washington Post when that decision was made, so I really can't speak to the decision making. But I will add, I believe it's the Neiman Lab, has found that 3/4 of major papers don't endorse. So the fact of not endorsing is unremarkable. A lot of papers don't endorse in presidential elections. In terms of the timing, I believe that our owner addressed it in that op-ed that I mentioned before, and I would encourage people to go read it.
I don't know if you've read David Halberstam's, The Powers That Be, but I commend it to all of you. It's a history of the American media, and it tells the story of who has owned our major media organizations over time. And from the end of the 19th century to today, the major media organizations in the United States of America have been owned by wealthy, opinionated individuals. They have largely been the philanthropic projects of wealthy, opinionated individuals up until more modern times. But that has been the case. You can see it from the Sulzbergers who own the New York Times to the Otises and the Chandlers who own the LA Times and helped elect Nixon governor of California, to Henry Luce, who owned Time Magazine and was a staunch anti-communist, to the Graham family at the Washington Post, and on it goes. There is precedent for owners of media having close relationships with the President of the United States, even supportive ones. Phil Graham, the owner of the Washington Post in the 50s and 60s, had a very close relationship with John F. Kennedy when he was president. There is a difference between having a close relationship and being asked to and accepting an invitation to standing behind the President of the United States with his cabinet at the inauguration. And what we don't know are the conversations that actually happen. And I want to go back to Halberstam's book, because there is hope that even with this dynamic where there are owners of large media organizations that have relationships with the President of the United States, people can still do their job as the owner of a major press organization. So the story that Halberstam tells is that in the 60s, when Kennedy was president of the United States, there was a project to build a bridge in Washington, D.C. It was the Theodore Roosevelt Bridge. And the Washington Post editorial page wanted that bridge to be built. The White House didn't like the aesthetics of the bridge, and they were very upset about it. And they were pushing back, and they were yelling at the Washington Post about it. And Phil Graham himself, according to the book, gets on the phone with the White House and says, "Let me tell you something. You're here for 4 to 8 years. We're here forever."
I just want to add, I mean, if you open our editorial pages right now, you're going to see, again, criticisms of both sides, because I'm lucky enough to work with colleagues that all believe in, we stand by free markets and personal liberties. That doesn't mean we always interpret them the same way as they apply to whatever issue we're talking about. That's the real fun of being on an editorial board. You're constantly arguing and duking it out. And that's like the joy of my job. I love getting to have intelligent conversations with my colleagues. But often, those ideals are trampled on no matter what party we're talking about. And so we had an editorial out, I think it was yesterday, but calling out the president and saying, you came into office making promises of mass deportations off of some valid concerns about porous borders and certain sanctuary policies. But the fact that you have gone so far with a sort of dragnet approach to deportations, and in many cases just simply unreasonable and cruel, has made it easy for states, like we were talking about a Maryland law that had just passed, to limit cooperation between the local and state law enforcement and how they deal with federal immigration enforcement. And so this is a case where I think it's like a pretty clear personal liberties question of when you go that far and you fly, or you just trample Americans' sense of decency in that way, these are the consequences, and these are the predictable consequences. Not to say that we had some qualms with the Maryland law, but that just goes to show that we're committed to looking, at least on the editorial board, we're committed to looking at the news through these shared ideals, and that often means calling out all types of people.
There is another very famous anecdote that some people actually dispute the authenticity of, is the famous story when this editorial executive from the New York Times was summoned to the White House by Kennedy because the FBI or someone told Kennedy that the New York Times was about to break the story about the Bay of Pigs going to happen, the invasion of Cuba. And this New York Times executive was summoned, and and scolded by Kennedy, telling him, listen, if you ever publish this, I want you to know that the blood of American soldiers might be on your hand. So don't publish it. The New York Times did not publish the story. We know what happened. And then a few weeks later, there was a reception at the White House, and Kennedy met again with this executive, and he took him and he told him, why did you listen to me? You would have spared me this embarrassment. And that's a very, I don't know if it's because it's a bit disputed, so I'm not sure it really happened, but it's kind of part of the lore of journalism in this country. But it tells you something about, well, you know, what the press is for. You know, speaking of the Washington Post story, etc., let me share with you, you know, how from afar I looked at it. There is something distinctive about especially American daily newspapers, and this something is called internal pluralism. Okay, so yes, the owners are opinionated, etc., but when you open your daily newspaper and you go to the op-ed pages, and it's the case, probably today in the Washington Post, you find a columnist who's leaning left, a columnist leaning right, etc., and hence in the same space you had these divergent views, and it's very distinctive. I lived for a long time in France. In France, you can buy a daily newspaper called L'Humanité, which is owned by the Communist Party. You can buy a daily, and they're dailies, you know, they're not like newsletters, dailies, called La Croix, the Cross, you guessed it, owned by the Catholic Church. By the way, a very good newspaper, a very good daily newspaper. So in order to form your opinion about the mosaic of opinions you have in your society, you need to buy many newspapers. In this country, tradition, which is related to the business model, etc., led to the fact that you had this luxury of actually buying one newspaper and having all these divergent views. And that's what has been destroyed little by little, especially by social media with the bubble effect. So now we have tribes. We go read people who think like us, and that's where I had a problem with Bezos' view on what the editorial pages should be, because he was very clear. He said personal freedoms and free markets. And those who don't agree with that, they can go elsewhere. That's the problem I had. And although I agree that I'm not sure it has been followed, that the Washington Post is still has diverse views, but it's not right, I think, for the owner of that newspaper was so mythical that as the Washington Post says that, because that's the last bastions we have for internal pluralism vis-a-vis what's going on with especially with cable news, but also what's happening in the internet with the silo effect, bubble effect, which destroys something which is absolutely crucial for the survival of democracy, is our ability to be confronted with opinions we dislike, and also our openness to change our opinion based on this contrary opinion.
I want to respond to that, because I think that I just want to make it clear that there's a difference between just the editorials. These are the unsigned opinions of the board, which we do believe in free markets and personal liberties. And again, that often means a lot of things. It never leans one side or the other. It's usually, that's the North Star. There's a difference between those unsigned editorials and then the op-eds and columns. Our opinion page is one of the most vibrant opinion pages in the country. You can open that up and get all types of takes from all types of people. You'll think of names like George Will, who have been providing their opinions for decades now at the Washington Post. And then you're gonna have Republican politicians, Democrat politicians. You're gonna get all types of political opinions on the op-ed side. These are packaged together. But I think that, I don't think it's fair to call out an editorial board for having a North Star, because most editorial boards have a pretty consistent editorial line. And people do come to the board particularly often to hear that editorial line. I encourage people, if you don't necessarily agree with it, to challenge yourself and read things that you don't agree with. I try to do that every day. I always encourage students to do that every day. Go read something that makes you cringe. But a great opinion page, like our opinion page, will give you a little taste of everything, and I'm really proud to work for an institution that does that.
We are very fortunate to live in a country where we can have opinion pages to report things and to say things that are uncomfortable, that are taboo, or that are challenging and questionable, right? And that leads me to one of the questions that we have from the panel, the audience, is about disinformation and how that is impacting a free press. We live in a world right now that is controlled by social media. So there is so much stuff out there at warp speed that it's very hard for us to correct everything, right? So there's so much out there. How does this impact our future for democracy and a free press?
I'll start that one. I think, as Corinne was saying, there's so much mis and disinformation that it starts to erode the confidence that people have in information. I'm not saying that it always translates to the more traditional, but I don't know about you. I'm on social media somewhat. I'm not on TikTok. We were not allowed to be on TikTok at the White House. And when I'm reading something now, if I see a picture or I see something that seems like unbelievable, I'll go to the New York Times or the Washington Post to see if it's real or if it's just, some AI-generated thing, which it often is. Sometimes you can tell because people don't look exactly the same, but sometimes you can't. But what I think the problem is that it just really erodes people's confidence. And it does do what you were talking about, which is people go to their corners. They start reading everything about, from people, or reading or watching people who agree with them. My husband has that well, it was MSNBC, MS Now. I'm like, as soon as I walk in the house, I'm like, turn it off. Why don't you just go have coffee with all your friends? You're just not learning anything. But I do think it's a very serious problem, and I wonder, it would be interesting to talk to the students, because I feel like my kids are more discerning than I am. They're just better at it, what they read on social media and how they can kind of sift out the BS to a certain extent.
I think students are definitely better, and just like the younger generations are definitely better at sniffing out AI. They just know the hallmarks and they're digital natives, and so it's like you have a sense for it. And so I'm less concerned about, I am concerned about AI influence, of course, but I think young people are going to be able to navigate that. I'm optimistic about that. I'm really concerned about what you've talked about on the silos. People, whether it's an AI-generated video or just a sensational commentator doing a vertical video on their phone, trying to confirm all of your worst fears, this is a real problem in our country right now. People are not reading things that challenge their ideas at all. They're not consuming things that challenge their ideas at all. And I think part of the challenge for big institutions like ours is we're trying not only to do like the written work that we're doing, the strong written work that we're doing, but to translate it into video and do video packages. And it's always really interesting because I'll just give an example. I went up to Maine and did a written campaign dispatch on the Democratic Senate primary up there. And a certain crowd read that. This is just sort of anecdotal, just based on the comments and what I heard from people. A certain crowd read it. And then a much younger crowd interacted with the video I did off of it. And so I think part of the way that we, at least like from a institution standpoint, at an institution like the Washington Post, part of the thing that I think we need to do in this growing media environment of silos and misinformation and all of this is we need to catch up with the times and package our product in a way that young people are going to consume so that they get a fact-checked, edited, deeply reported alternative.
Yeah, just to build up on this, the problem of disinformation, of misinformation, I'm going to trivialize it a little bit. Think of it as any product you buy, right? You don't have, as a consumer, you don't have the wherewithals, the resources to do a market study, to check everything about this product every time you want to buy that product. So that's the power of brands. And brands are built on reputation, and hence the importance of legacy media. You need to have people who are owning your media to have skin in the game. because then you can punish them if they err. That's what used to happen for a very long time. If you, of course, probably you know the story of the Washington Post and how it decided to publish the Pentagon papers, etc., etc. And there's this famous scene when Meryl Streep is struggling with the decision in the movie, and in fact, it's the legacy, the heritage, that makes her make that decision against the wishes of her lawyers, of her shareholders, etc., because it was a legacy. The problem today is a lot of the media are owned by people who are making fortunes elsewhere. So they don't have that much skin in the game. And I think it's one of the problems that we are facing today. But I do believe that media literacy is important, that we need to educate our kids into seeing through, the BS in the media, but that's not enough. I think that something systemic needs to be done about the nature of the ownership of the media.
The big lie can destroy a society, whether that's in Weimar Germany or Rwanda or the United States. This is a huge societal problem, and we now have electronics that can amplify a lie into a big lie, and we all need to be vigilant about that and be aware of that. Your children, Lorraine, may be exceptional. Because what a lot of the research shows, and including disclosed corporate documents from some of these social media companies, is that the algorithms of these social media companies point to us where we emotionally want to go, so we stay on the app. The business model is to keep us on the app. If we stay on the app, the company gets more data, the company is able to do more with the data. And it doesn't really care what it is that we're seeing, it just knows what keeps us on the app. And we're dealing with that differently individually, all of us. Some of us are prone to radicalization. We want to see that. Some of us are prone to body image material. Some of us are prone to our sports teams, things that are totally innocuous. But on those edges, that's a real problem. And that's not a user issue, that's a company issue. And it would be helpful for all of us to be vigilant in thinking about this. There are 2 juries that came out with verdicts that found that these social media companies were responsible for addicting young children to their apps, to their physical detriment. And so this is a huge problem. Number 2, I'll be brief. Disinformation is not a right. Anybody who works in the media knows that when they're even when they're on the editorial page or on the news pages, they've got to get it right. If it's a public figure, they have to act with actual malice, but they're going to have calls with their lawyers, even if the stuff is called out as being inaccurate and they know it, it's going to be a problem. There is no right to disinformation. And I think that we need to be real thoughtful about what we are putting into the public sphere. There are complicated questions about how the government deals with that, because when you have state actors, then you are implicating potentially the First Amendment rights of the people who are promoting that disinformation, and the conversation gets confused. But there's a responsibility that every right holder has. And we need to, part of what we're talking about is people's erosion of trust in the media. The media needs to do a good job of providing us with accurate information.
We have a student question who said, "Why do I not see the press reporting on the president's involvement with Epstein?" That is a student question. Sorry.
I feel like I haven't stopped seeing the press report about just the administration's Epstein debacle here. And I mean, in fact, this is part of the reason the mismanagement of the Epstein files in particular in the DOJ has led to a huge personnel shakeup. So I think media and strong reporting has actually done a really good job of holding the administration accountable on, not just in this area, but in various areas, on how they've handled scandals and mismanagement in places like the Department of Homeland Security. really strong national reporting really shaped what happened there as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, this discussion reminds me another interesting similar event, and that was the Monica Lewinsky story. And at that time, it might be a conspiracy theory, by the way, it might be the same with Epstein here. But Clinton decided to attack Iraq just after the Monica Lewinsky story broke out in 1998. And there's a movie about it with Dustin Hoffman and Walk the Dog, with Dustin Hoffman and Robert De Niro, which is actually not based because it was published it was aired just before, yeah. And so why am I saying this? Because one of the very important things in the American Constitution is who declares war. And it's the Congress, right? But the last war that was declared by the Congress was World War II. By the way, for very valid reasons, it hasn't been declared since then. There are technical military reasons why it's hard to live up to this rule. But what's important is to remember why the founding fathers have decided that Congress should be the one to declare war. And there is this very interesting saying, and almost, it's not my words, the words of James Madison. He said, war is the midwife of executive aggrandizement. War is the midwife of executive aggrandizement, which means that he understood that whenever there was, by the way, war can be anything. By war, it means an existential threat to the community, to the society, right? So he understood that whenever the executive tells you your life is in danger, our lives are in danger, you close your eyes and you say, please help us, please just protect us. We don't care about what the Washington Post is saying. We don't care. We want the FBI to have homeland security, etc., etc. And for him, it was the start of the descent into dictatorship. And that's why war needs. So although it's today in our nuclear age, complicated to get the legislative glacial pace decide when to declare war, because that's basically the problem. But it's very important that legislatively there are an innovative process to make sure that this very important realization by James Madison is today implemented, is that there is a control over who declares war and why and for what reasons. And I'm saying this in this context because the Epstein story went in the background with the attack on Iran. Thank you.
Abu Bakr, I'm glad you mentioned the founders of the Constitution, because it brings up one of the lessons that I talk about with my students in class, which is the history of the First Amendment, where the First Amendment came from. And the fact that the founding fathers knew that they did not like how things were run under the rule of the king. And when they founded this land and they decided to create a new country, they decided that they needed to protect the press. They knew there was a reason to have a free press, because without a free press, you cannot have a free people. You cannot have free people. And so that is part of the historical lessons that we talk about when we talk about a First Amendment. There is no other occupation mentioned in the First Amendment. The only one is the press, right? We have free of religion and the right to protest and grieve the government, et cetera, et cetera. But they knew that there was an essential piece to having a democracy. They did not want the king to have to approve everything that the press reported. They did not want to have a governor's stamp, the governor who represented the monarchy in the United States at the time in the colonies, right? So we look at that history and we forget quite often that the press is a very essential part of this democracy of this country. Does anybody want to address more on that? Perhaps Josh, since you want to take a legal perspective. Or just, what's that? What's that? Just agree. Just agree? Okay. So we have another question here about what is a fact, since we were talking about disinformation. I can tell you what disinformation is for those of you who may not know the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is accidental. there's no intention with it. But disinformation has the intention to deceive. So it's a lie. It's an intentional lie put out there in order to deceive the public, the people, in order to manipulate how they think, what they do, etc. So when we talk about disinformation, misinformation, now let's talk about the opposite of that, which is what is a fact?
I think I'm not going to answer the question directly. Well, a fact is a fact. A fact is just what happened. But the problem has been how it's packaged. And that's, I think, at the core of why trust in the media has been decreasing. And why people now, outside of traditional media, there are certainly plenty of good actors, but some bad actors are able to hijack the gray areas of fact for their own purposes, or to sow division between us. But I think that a lot of the complaints about mainstream media over the last decades really about, it was less about, is what I'm reading factual, and it was more about why am I not seeing why am I seeing this story but not that story? And so when I've covered a lot of, I was on the campaign trail during the Trump campaign. I was covering all the GOP candidates, and after the primary covered the president's campaign. And people really had a lot of distrust because they felt, for example, President Biden wasn't covered enough. They didn't think COVID was covered fairly, all these things. And so I think it is worth having a conversation, not about, I think it's unfair when you call out a story where the facts don't confirm your priors, and when they offend your own ideology and sensibility, that's just not fair. The facts are the facts. But it's important to talk about what we're covering and if we're covering things broadly. And so I have a lot of confidence in my colleagues do a lot of hard-hitting, deep reporting that affects a lot of change in our country. This is happening at a lot of institutions. And I'm excited to see that people are thinking about, okay, how can we expand and cover more and regain trust from Americans?
I just want to add that I agree with you about facts being facts. I think sometimes what happens with folks is it's the unnamed source. So unnamed sources say this, unnamed sources say that. And I think that can really start, at least for people for whom I worked, that can really start making them doubt the facts. And the facts may all be right, but I just think having that situation, and I know some papers and broadcast outlets are moving toward no unnamed sources, but they seem to be moving away from that now. But I do think that's just a factor, that can really affect people's trust in what's really a fact.
No, just to speak to that point, Lorraine, I'd like to push back a little bit because as a journalist in Morocco, we had a lot of unnamed sources in our reporting, and there was a very good reason for that, at least from my perspective. It's because we would be putting them in jeopardy if we had published the name of the source. So the system forced on us, the only way for us to report is, of course, we are honest, we don't fabricate facts, but the ecosystem we were evolving in was not protective of the sources. And that's my fear about the US today, is that I do understand the journalists who are using unnamed sources if they are in situations where they cannot, if these sources would be unduly threatened by the system.
I totally understand that and completely agree. I think where the problem occurs, and as someone who's been on the other end of it, when a reporter may want something salacious, and I'm not saying this is you, Corinne, in any way, but may want something salacious, and they call and they say, well, I won't use your name, but didn't you see this or didn't you think that? And it's my job as a citizen and an honest person, to either say, which I tried to do a lot, no, you can put my name to anything I say. I really did always try, and not 100% of the time. And one of my former bosses from a campaign is sitting back there, so I don't want to say anything that he'd be like, oh yeah? But no, but I get that, and I think that's super important, and it's kind of scary now what's happening.
I do think there are times where it's appropriate for a source to provide information to the media anonymously or with minimal identification. And I do think it's perfectly appropriate for the journalist or the news media organization to print what the source said if they know it's credible, if they can figure out that it's credible. And that's a big part, and that's what goes around in the newsroom. Is this person credible? Is there another source? Very funny anecdotes of government officials yelling at a reporter that they can't believe you're reporting on X, and in doing so confirming that X is true. I think it's important for us to get our information that way. Particularly for the students out there, though, there is a difference between fact and opinion. As a legal matter, fact is actionable in a defamation case. Opinion is not. If an opinion is predicated on published facts, and those facts aren't true, and they're defamatory, those published facts could be actionable for defamation, even though the ultimate opinion about those purported facts is not itself going to be actionable for defamation. Where news media can get into trouble with the reporting of certain facts that aren't facts is when motivations for eyeballs, clicks, political agendas, personal agendas come into play. It's sloppiness. And there's such a need for speed. There's so much ability to get the information out there that we sometimes have the reckless delivery of information. And that's part of what's upsetting us about the news media. And that is true. That's resident in lots of places. That is a whole different thing from Russian bots telling us on purpose something they know isn't true is true. There were multiple indictments of Russians who were doing this in the 2016 election. A bipartisan Senate Select Committee on Intelligence found that the Russian government was trying to interfere in our presidential election by recruiting people to amplify things they knew weren't true to make us a more divisive society and to help elect one person president. That is active disinformation. That is very different from people being upset about the media not covering one story or another story. That's a whole other degree of problem, and yet it is a problem.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to give each person on the panel a minute to say something that maybe we were not asked about the demise of a free press, which is the title of this panel. So let's start with Karine, and we'll just work our way down.
Oh, that's a lot of pressure. I just wouldn't use the word demise. I think a lot of changes are happening right now, and especially, and there's been a lot of chilling effects coming out of the government. I'm on record saying I think we should, for example, abolish the FCC. It can be a political cudgel either way. And we don't have 3 radio stations anymore. We can find our news anywhere. And so that's something that I was hoping we'd touch on. But all that being said, we've seen really scary things happening, including to one of my colleagues. And yet the legal rebukes have been really heartening. The system is working. And just because a lot of change is happening, let's zoom out a little, just because a lot of change is happening in the media environment itself does not mean that the free press is crumbling. Change had to happen. Again, this demise in trust of the press as an institution has been happening. This is a consistent trend, and it had to be addressed. And I think you're seeing it across a lot of media outlets. Don't assume that a change is being made for the wrong reasons. A lot of people are recalibrating, including to the way that we receive our news and the way that we interface with news. I gave the anecdote of the vertical video, for example. And so change is hard, growing pains are growing pains, but I feel really heartened by our legal system, and I'm optimistic, and I think this is the greatest country in the world because of the types of freedoms that we have, including this freedom of the press.
I mean, two things. At the risk of appearing antiquated and ancient, I think that we need to recover. We still have it, I shouldn't say that, because there are media, and I mean by media here, daily printed newspapers that are still with us, but there is something magical that happens in this special type of media. There are several studies that shown how superior they are in terms of vetting the information for many reasons. There is a magic that happens in the newsroom when journalists discuss and debate among each other. There is also a very interesting limit to what they can do in terms of they do not publish instantly. They do have, you have a time frame, so you have a respiration moment where you can deal with the news, and you don't just go to your phone and then you publish something, you click it. You have to go through editors, you have to go through your colleagues, and we need to find something that fulfills that role. To keep doing that. The second point is, Josh mentioned it a little bit, is the issue of the platforms. I think it's a big problem that the platforms are benefiting from the protection of Section 230 from the Communication Act of 1996, which very simply means that they are not accountable to what they publish, what is published. And to me, they are publishers for a very simple reason. The moment you decide to send a newsfeed to someone and you have an algorithm or some people deciding what you should see or not, you are an editor. That's what an editor does. And as such, they need to be taken accountable, held accountable as editors and as publishers.
I agree with Karine. I don't think the free press is in demise, but I do think it's being reshaped. And that has a lot to do with technology, the social media platforms, and just economics. So, but what I would like, just in my closing remarks, is to share with you what I think individuals can do to ensure a free press. And the first thing is to stay informed and to really educate yourself, and don't just take one source, don't just look at one something on your social media feed. You know, Justice Souter, former Justice Souter, do you still say Justice Souter? Justice Souter talked about the pervasive civic ignorance as being a major threat to democracy. And I think about that and how important it is to be educated and to understand what's going on. And I will tell you this, I got to go to a class, political science class yesterday here at the university, and it was so heartening because these students asked me really hard questions and they knew very specifically what was going on in Washington, D.C. Also, you know, I think it's very important to understand that, as Karine says, like the media is doing, a lot of the media is doing a really good job, but we have to, you know, we have to hold them to account too, and we have to understand media literacy and facts versus opinion, and when we're reading or seeing what we're seeing. And then I would just always encourage a civil discourse, because when people just go to their corners and start screaming at each other, no one gets enlightened, and no one is doing anything to save a free press. And with that, you know, Karine has mentioned, like, some of her colleagues have been targeted. So anything in our discourse, in our action to prevent the harassment of journalists, I think is super important. And I was just thinking when you were speaking, like, I'm really glad you don't have signed editorials, because I do have friends who work in the media who do. And the threats and the horrible things that are said and sent to them is really, really upsetting. So with
That's what op-eds are for.
Exactly. So thank you very much.
It's very hard to add anything else after my three co-panelists' thoughts, but I will leave you with this. When in 2013, the President of the United States and the Attorney General changed the policy of the United States government not to prosecute journalists for doing their jobs, they did it because the whole of the press corps pushed back. And we're going to need us to help the press continue to have its courage to push back on the government. It is truly and Vicki, thank you for moderating. You've done a fabulous job. As Vicki so eloquently said, to the point where we had nothing else to add about the history of the press and the value of the press to our open, free, democratic, and informed society, we all need to take this personally.
Thank you all for attending the Conference on World Affairs, and please join me in giving a round of applause to our guests.